Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about half an hour of history together. My name is Jason Kishineff, and we're reading an Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Smack dab in the middle of Chapter 5. If you like the show, if you like the episode, hit that like and subscribe button and hit that notification bell, because YouTube has been known to unsubscribe people who watch stuff like this show. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for sticking it out. I know this isn't really easy to hear. A lot of this history. Real history isn't. Let's dig in. Assault on the Cherokee Nation. In the unconquered indigenous region of the Old Southwest, parallel resistance took place during the 2 decades following U.S. independence, with similar tragic results, thanks to extirpative settler warfare. Tennessee, formerly claimed but not settled by the British colony of North Carolina, was carved out of the larger Cherokee Nation and became a state in 1796. Its eastern part, particularly the area around today's Knoxville, was a war zone. The mostly Scots-Irish squatters, attempting to secure and expand their settlements, were at war with the resistant Cherokees called Chickamaugas. The settlers hated both the indigenous people whom they were attempting to displace, as well as the newly formed federal government. In 1784, a group of North Carolina settlers, led by settler ranger John Sevier, it's either Sevier or Sevier, depending on if you're going to be a total American about it or pronounce it the French way. I'm going with John Sevier. Had seceded from Western Carolina and established the independent country of Franklin with Sevier as president. Neither North Carolina nor the federal government had exerted any control over the settlements of the eastern Tennessee Valley region. In the summer of 1788, Sevier ordered an unprovoked preemptive attack on the Chickamauga towns, killing 30 villagers and forcing the survivors to flee south. Sevier's actions formed a template for settler-federal relations, with the settlers implementing the federal government's final solution, while the federal government feigned an appearance of limiting settler invasions of indigenous lands. Facing the fierce resistance of indigenous nations in the Ohio country and the fighting between the Muskogee Nation and the state of Georgia, Washington's administration sought to contain indigenous resistance in the South. Yet now the settlers were provoking the Cherokees in what would soon be the state of Tennessee. Secretary of War Knox claimed to believe that the thickness of settlers' development, converting indigenous hunting grounds into farms, would slowly overwhelm the indigenous nations and drive them out. He advised the squatters' leaders to continue building, which would attract more illegal settlers. This disingenuous view ignored the fact that the indigenous farmers were well aware of the intentions of the settlers to destroy them and seize their territories. In the 1785 Treaty of Hopewell between the federal government and the Cherokee Nation, the United States had agreed to restrict settlement to the east of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The several thousand squatter families who claimed nearly 1 million acres of land in precisely that zone were not about to abide by the treaty. Knox saw the situation as a showdown with the settlers and a test of federal authority west of the mountain chains from Canada to Spanish Florida. The settlers did not believe that the federal government meant to protect their interests, which encouraged them to go it alone. In the face of constant attacks, the Cherokees were desperate to halt the destruction of their towns and fields. Many were starving, many without shelter, on the move as refugees, with only the Chickamauga fighters as a protective force fighting off the seasoned Ranger settler Indian killers. In July 1791, the Cherokees reluctantly signed the Treaty of Holston, agreeing to abandon any claims to land on which the Franklin settlements sat in return for an annual annuity of $100,000 from the federal government. The United States did nothing to halt the flow of squatters into Cherokee territory as the boundary was drawn in the treaty. A year after the treaty was signed, war broke out, and the Chickamaugas, under the leadership of Dragging Canoe, attacked squatters, even laying siege to Nashville. The war continued for 2 years with 500 Chickamauga fighters joined by Muskogees and a contingent of Shawnees from Ohio, led by Chpt? It sounds like cheesy cow, but it's not spelled quite like cheesy cow. Cheesy cow, one of Tecumseh's brothers, who was later killed in the fighting. The settlers organized an offensive against the Chickamaugas. The federal Indian agent attempted The federal Indian agent attempted to persuade the Chickamaugas to stop fighting, warning that the frontier settlers were always dreadful not only to the warriors but to the innocent and helpless women and children and old men. The agent also warned the settlers against attacking indigenous towns. But he had to order the militia to disperse a mob of 300 settlers who, as he wrote, out of a mistaken zeal to serve their country, had gathered to destroy as many as they could of the Cherokee towns. Sevier and his rangers invaded the Chickamaugas town in September 1793 with the stated mission of total destruction. Although forbidden by the federal agent to attack the villages, Sevier gave orders for a scorched earth offensive. By choosing to attack at harvest time, Sevier intended to starve out the residents. The strategy worked. Soon after, the federal agent reported to the Secretary of War that the region was pacified, with no indigenous actions since the visit General Sevier paid the Cherokee Nation. A year later, Sevier demanded absolute submission from the Chickamauga villages lest they be wiped out completely. Receiving no response, a month later, 1,750 Franklin Rangers attacked 2 villages, burning all the buildings and fields, again near the harvest, and shooting those who tried to flee. Sevier then repeated his demand for submission, requiring the Chickamaugas to abandon their towns for the woods, taking only what they could transport. He wrote, "War will cost the United States much money and some lives, but it will destroy the existence of your people as a nation forever." The remaining Chickamauga villages agreed to allow the settlers to remain in Cherokee country. In squatter settlements, ruthless leaders like Sevier were not the exception, but the rule. Once they had full control and got what they wanted, they made their peace with the federal government, which in turn depended on their actions to expand the republic's territory. Sevier went on to serve as a U.S. representative from North Carolina and as governor of Tennessee, To this day, such men are idolized as great heroes, embodying the essence of the American spirit. A bronze statue of John Sevier and his ranger uniform stands today in the National Sanctuary Hall of the U.S. Capitol. Wow. Muskogee resistance. The Muskogee Nation officially had remained neutral in the war between the Anglo-American settlers and the British monarchy. Nonetheless, many individual Muskogees had taken the opportunity to raid and harass squatters within their national territories in Georgia. Their territories in Georgia, Tennessee, and South Carolina. When the United States was formed, the Muskogee Nation turned to Spanish Florida for an alliance in trying to stop the flow of squatters into their territory. Spain had an interest in the alliance as a buffer to its holdings, which at that time included the lower Mississippi and the city of New Orleans. The squatters believed that the Muskogees and the Spanish officials, as well as the British, were in cahoots to keep them out of western Georgia and present-day Alabama, and considered the Muskogee Nation to be the main barrier to their permanent settlement in the region, particularly Georgia. The Muskogees called the squatters Ekunnaunuksolji. That's quite a word. Ekunnaunuksolji. I'm sure I'm butchering that. Sorry. It means people greedily grasping after the lands of the red people. Alright. The federal government negotiated with the Muskogee Nation for a new boundary and for more settlements and trade in exchange for $60,000 a year in goods. And we all know how the United States treaties with Native Americans went. The squatters did everything they could to provoke the Muskogees to war, while ignoring the treaty's provisions. They slaughtered hundreds of deer in the Muskogee deer parks with the intention of wiping out the livelihood of Muskogee hunters, who also made up the resistance forces. But the War Department was complicit, using money due to the Muskogees under the treaty to divide them by bribing leaders, Mikos, and thus isolating the insurgents from their communities. 80 Muskogee fighters joined the Chickamaugas when they were still fighting, and together they attacked the Cumberland district of Tennessee in early 1792, while others struck Georgia squatters in Muskogee territory. It was then that Shawnee delegates, sent by Tecumseh, visited from the Ohio country to encourage the Muskogees to drive the squatters from their lands, as the Shawnees had done successfully up to that time. Secretary of War Knox wrote to the federal agent in Georgia that he knew the Muskogee militants were a banditti and do not implicate the whole nor any considerable part of that nation. The hostilities of the individuals arise from their own disposition and are not probably dictated either by the chiefs or by any towns or other respectable classes of the Indians. By this time, in the process of the preceding British colonization and continuing with U.S. colonization of the Muskogee Nation and other southeastern indigenous nations, an indigenous client class called compradores by Africans, caciques, in Spanish colonized America, essential to colonialist projects, was firmly in place. This privileged class was dependent on their colonial masters for their personal wealth. The class division racked the traditional relatively egalitarian and democratic indigenous societies internally. The small elite in the southeast embraced the enslavement of Africans, and a few even became affluent planters in the style of southern planters, mainly through intermarriage with Anglos. The trading posts established by U.S. merchants further divided Muskogee society, pulling many deeply into the U.S. economy through dependency and debt. We all know how that feels. And away from the Spanish and British trading firms, which had previously left their lands undisturbed. This method of colonization by co-optation and debt proved effective wherever employed by colonial powers in the world, but only when it was accompanied by extreme violence at any sign of indigenous insurgency. The United States moved across North America in this manner. While most Muskogees continued to follow their traditional democratic ways in their villages, the elite Muskogees were making decisions and compromises on their behalf that would bear tragic consequences for them all. Gatekeepers, Howard Zinn called them. He wasn't referring specifically to Native Americans, but that group that becomes kind of the upper class rewards a little bit to protect, to keep, to kind of buffer from the the lower rankings, the poorest of among us, and the wealthy. They kind of promote these gatekeepers. Federal authorities of 1793 identified 500 Muskogee towns where they believed the majority of insurgents resided. Secretary of War Knox called on the Georgia militia for federal service. The federal Indian agent notified the War Department that the settlers were set on assaulting the Muskogees and asked that 1,000 federal troops be deployed to occupy the insurgent Muskogee towns. Although the War Department rejected that idea and war was postponed, the restless Georgian militiamen deserted after having rushed to the Muskogee territory to loot, burn, and kill, only to be forced to wait. Persistent squatter attacks on Muskogee farmers, traders, and towns continued. During the winter of 1793 to 94, Georgia border squatters formed an armed group of landless settlers. The leader, Elijah Clark, was a veteran Indian killer and had been a major general in the Georgia militia during the War of Independence, in which he commanded rangers to destroy indigenous towns and fields. As a U.S. Patriot hero, Clark was certain that his former troops would never take up arms against him. Clark and his rangers declared the independence of their own republic, but Georgia state authorities captured him and destroyed the rebel stronghold. Still, Clark's actions sent a strong message to state and federal authorities that landless squatters were determined to take indigenous lands. They would get the leader they needed for that purpose a decade later. Meanwhile, the elite of the Muskogee towns were successful in marginalizing the insurgents, while the federal government increased grants, and the wealthy class of Muskogees established trading posts, making whiskey cheaply available to impoverished Muskogees. The die is cast. The successful settler intrusion into western Georgia made Alabama and Mississippi the next objectives for the rapidly expanding slave-worked plantation economy, which, along with land sales of occupied indigenous lands by private speculators, was essential to the U.S. economy as a whole. The plantation economy required vast swaths of land for cash crops even before cotton was king, leaving in its wake destroyed indigenous national territories and Anglo settlers who would fight and die driving out the indigenous communities, yet remain landless themselves, moving on to the next frontier to try again. U.S. colonization produced the subsequent hideous slavery-based rule of the Old Southwest, which would flourish for 7 more decades. Unlike in the Ohio country, the Washington administration avoided force and in doing so alienated settlers in the region. By preventing them from wiping out the Muskogees, the federal government was seen as the enemy, just as the British authority had been for an earlier generation of determined settlers. But that would soon change with the Muskogee War of 1813 and 14, narrated in the following chapter, in which, as Robert V. Rimini puts in Andrew Jackson and his Indian Wars, Tennessee frontiersman Andrew Jackson, commanding both regular army troops and frontiersmen, personally guaranteed that the Creeks would feel the full brunt of total war. During 1810 to 1815, then, 2 parallel wars were ongoing. One in the Ohio country, the Old Northwest, which ended with the defeat of the Tecumseh-led alliance, and the other, the war against the Muskogee Nation in 1813-1814. Unlike the 1812 to 1815 war between Britain and the United States, with which these wars overlapped, the situation did not return to things being as they had been before, but rather culminated in the elimination of indigenous power east of the Mississippi. That right there, that says everything about what I learned in history before college. You learn about the War of 1812, you don't learn anything about any of this that's going on, in that time, in the background. How it affected the Native Americans. They don't even talk about it. U.S. conquest was not determined by the defeat of the British in the Battle of 1815, but rather by genocidal war and forced removal. U.S. leaders brought counterinsurgency out of the pre-independence period into the new republic, imprinting on the fledgling federal army a way of war with formidable consequences for the contingent and the world. Counterinsurgent warfare and ethnic cleansing targeted indigenous civilians continued to define U.S. war making through the 19th century, with markers such as the 3 U.S. counterinsurgent wars against the Seminoles, through the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 to Wounded Knee in 1890. Early on, regular armies had incorporated these strategies and tactics as a way of war to which it often turned, although frequently the regular army simply stood by while local militias and settlers acting on their own used terror against indigenous non-combatants. Irregular warfare could be waged west of the Mississippi as it had been earlier against the Abenakis, Cherokees, Shawnees, Muskogees, and even Christian Indians. In the Civil War, these methods played a prominent role on both sides. Confederate regular forces, Confederate guerrillas such as William Quantrill, and General Sherman for the Union all engaged in waging total war against civilians. The pattern would continue in U.S. military interventions overseas, from the Philippines and Cuba to Central America, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. The cumulative effect goes beyond simply the habitual use of military means and becomes the very basis for U.S. American identity. The Indian fighting frontiersmen and the valiant settlers in their circled covered wagons are the iconic images of that identity. The continued popularity of and respect for the genocidal sociopath Andrew Jackson is another indicator. Actual men such as Robert Rogers, Daniel Boone, John Sevier, and David Crockett, as well as fictitious ones created by James Fenimore Cooper and other best-selling writers, call to mind D.H. Lawrence's myth of the essential white American, that the essential American soul is a killer. Thanks for joining me. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, hit that like and subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you're notified when I make a new video. We'll see you next time.